يا عظيم الله. جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم.
This year, our keynote speaker is Professor Sherman Jackson. First, I would say that the West Coast is blessed. Sherman Jackson has left Michigan. We've been trying to wrestle him to the West Coast for quite some time. And finally, we managed to bring him to the West Coast in California. We tell him the weather is better. We wanted him to come up to Northern California, but he is at USC, and as many of you know, it's almost a taxi drive with Southwest and the airlines. It's almost 1 hour flight from here to Los Angeles. He's not a stranger to our community. He has been coming to California as far as I remember. Our first invite to Professor Sherman Jackson was in 1996, participating in a conference at Berkeley, and I remember he stayed at Durant Hotel, where there was a cafe downstairs that we met with, I think, Mikhail Fleming early in the morning. Currently, he is the King Faisal Chair of Islamic Thought and Culture and Professor of Religion and American Studies and Ethnicities at the University of Southern California at USC. So I know that the community in Southern California is blessed to have Sherman Jackson with them. Without exaggeration, I would say that Sherman Jackson is one of the foremost Muslim intellectuals in the United States, contributing in academia, and his writings and his contribution has been cited and is the focal point of studies and engagement across the fields, not only in Islamic studies, but in ethnic studies, in American studies, in legal studies relative to Islamic law and others. So it is fitting for us at Zaytuna College, as we are building our institution, to call on him to provide us, once again, from the idea that al-Dîn al-Nasiha, that he's given us counsel, not from a distance, but from being within the fold of Muslims in America and being our foremost intellectual to offer us his ideas, his thoughts, and his advice as we are building this institution. Last year, we had the president of GTU, James Donahue, who offered us his counsel, and I would like to please welcome with me Professor Sherman Jackson, and we ask Allah to bless him and continue to expand his breast and to continue to expand his intellectual contribution. Please welcome Sherman Jackson.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي وقني شر نفسي وفات لساني وإن أضل بغير حق رب العالمين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله and good evening. I want to thank Hatem for that overly generous introduction, but I want to say that I think maybe Sheikh Hamza can give us a fatwa on calling people out in terms of how long ago you met them, because I think that might reveal things about their age and other things that they might not want revealed. And in the spirit of outing people, let me follow up with another outing. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and I, we met not in 1996, but actually 1986 in the city of Mecca, al-Mukarramah. And it has been a wonderful addition to my life. He has been a man from whom I have learned and benefited much. I have a very limited amount of time to speak to you, so I want to try to narrow down just a few points that hopefully will be meaningful in some capacity or another as Zaytuna College embarks upon this enterprise of building itself into what we all know that we as an American Muslim community, and not simply as an American Muslim community, the American community at large is benefited and empowered, and it will derive much meaningful production from a first-rate Islamic seminary that can produce the kinds of scholars, that can produce the kind of intellectual output that will actually enable Muslims to speak effectively to the realities that define America as a society. And I must say that it is both a profound honor and a hauntingly weighty burden for me to stand before you in this capacity tonight. The honor resides in my recognition of the deep and profound historical significance of this moment that we are in right now. And that is both in the context of the development of Islam in America. And I think in that regard, we have to remember, I've said this on numerous occasions, and I hope that this is something that will buoy both the faculty and the staff and the students at Zaytuna College as they progress into the future. We have to remember that the people who founded Harvard University were not themselves graduates of Harvard University. And so what we have to remember, that though things may have humble beginnings, if we maintain a sense of historical consciousness and recognize the role that we have been called upon to play by God Almighty, it is not an accident that we are in this place, in this time, under these circumstances. And for us to recognize that Allah has put us here for a purpose, and that He does not burden us with anything that we are incapable of bearing. For us to recognize that may mean that we will dig down deeply enough to acquire the kinds of skills, the kinds of passion, and the kinds of courage that will enable us to repeat an experience that many other American communities that have come before us have actually done. And that is in the building of great institutions. Let us not be misled by the humble origins of this institution as it begins today. Let us instead not be disabused of a belief in ourselves and in who we are and of the tradition out of which we come and what our predecessors themselves, with much more meager resources than those that we possess today, have been able to produce in the way of institutions that have grown to be the envy of the world. In this context, it is very humbling for me to stand here before you because in doing so, I am in some ways following a tradition that has gone back about 1,000 years in Islam. This is not a tradition that was born in America. Muslim institutions going back about 1,000 years also had convocations. And they would have convocations in which some great, highly reputed scholar would come and give an inaugural lecture. And the lecture itself would be attended by students, by faculty, by notables, and the public. And the whole point of his standing before that audience was to inspire in those students a love for learning, and to inspire in them the belief that with the requisite years of commitment and arduous study, that they too could produce what he was showcasing before them in that very moment. This is what so humbles me as I stand here before you today, because I happen to be aware of some of those great scholars who have stood before audiences and delivered those convocations. And when I compare my paltry and humble little achievements and contributions as a scholar and an intellectual with the grand and glorious contributions that those scholars have made, I am deeply humbled to think that I may be standing here representing a tradition in which they stand. This is the tradition of the great al-Ghazâlîs, the Ibn Sabbag's, the Abu Bakr al-Shamis, and countless, countless others. And so as I stand before you, I am humbled, and I am deeply honored. But I am honored not simply because I am standing before you in the capacity of a Muslim representing a long and glorious tradition within Islam. I'm also honored because I recognize the profundity and the importance of this moment. And I am very proud to be a part of what I hope and pray will grow into the premier institution of Muslim higher learning that will be the envy of Muslim institutions of higher learning across the globe. I understand the meaning of what is happening here today. Seeds are being sown, and with the proper effort and the proper understanding of our place in this world, this will be the beginning of something that history will talk about for many, many centuries to come. I am deeply aware of that, and I believe that very firmly. I believe that this is the beginning of something great, and I'm very honored to be a part of that. At the same time, however, I feel inescapably burdened. There's a heavy sense of weight that sits upon my shoulders, even as I recognize the importance of what we are doing here today. Because as both moderns, and perhaps even more especially as Americans, the challenges and the opportunities that confront us here in this life that we live in this country are in many ways uniquely ours. And in that capacity, while we may be inspired, instructed, and even profitably challenged by the tradition that has been bequeathed to us by our ancestors, we cannot look to our intellectual ancestors alone to undertake a task that only we can be expected to execute with any real meaning and effectiveness. It is we who must understand the reality that defines our lives. It is we who must understand that which is essential of our tradition and that which is coincidental. It is we who are the custodial generation who must look out into our indigenous heritage as Americans, as moderns, as Westerners, and we must make a determination as to what in our own indigenous heritage is consistent with the values and the vision and the interests of Islam and Muslims as a community, and which is not. And we must make a determination as to how all of that is to be integrated into a holistic vision of who and what we are as a community in this country. And as I said, we may look to our ancestors for inspiration. We may look to them for instruction. But it is we, the custodial generation, that must determine the use to which the tradition that we have been bequeathed will be put to in this country, in this time, in this place. And that is an enormous challenge for us to stand up to. But it is a challenge that will make the difference between whether Islam in this country will be simply a flash in the pan, something that came and went with very little fanfare, or whether or not we will be the beginning of something that will permanently enable generations, hundreds of years into the future, to pursue a life that holds a chance of earning God's pleasure. This is the challenge that I think that Zaytuna, as a college, as an institution of Muslim higher learning, must confront. must face, must see as its mission to rise to. And I want to say a few words about that and speak especially and specifically to the students of Zaytuna. But before I do that, there is a preliminary issue that I would like to briefly address. And it's only preliminary in essence, not in time. Because I believe this issue to be critical to our success as Muslims in this part of the world, not only in building institutions like Zaytuna College, but rather in reinstating the civilizational power and the civilizational worth and effectiveness of Islam as a lived way of life. The preliminary issue that I am speaking of has to do with our ability to invest in human capital. This may strike many of you as being rather obvious. But in my many years teaching at the university, in which capacity I have come in contact with literally hundreds, if not thousands, of students here and in other parts of the world, to my mind, among the most dangerous threats that has confronted Muslims in the modern world has been that they have encountered an experience that has tended in many ways to reduce them to a mindset, a point of departure, a basic presupposition that looks upon human ingenuity, creative energy, and intellectual exploration with great suspicion. And oftentimes with so much suspicion that it becomes difficult for all of these God-given talents to be brought to full fruition. And without these God-given talents being brought to full fruition, we will not be able to produce the kinds not only of educational institutions, but of social institutions, of economic institutions, family structures. We need human creative capacities. We need human intellectual capacities. We need human imagination to be invested in full. Because then and only then will we be able to approach the grand and glorious achievements of our great ancestors. These were men and women who, yes, mastered the Islamic sciences, mastered the Quran, mastered the Sunnah, mastered usul al-fiqh, but at the same time they were able to unleash the human capacities in their societies to the point that those societies were able to produce dazzling works of art, dazzling works of architecture, dazzling works of literature, to the point that Muslim society could become a healthy, wholesome whole. That one did not have to be a Muslim only in a strictly devotional capacity. That one could have fun as a Muslim. That one could enjoy beauty as a Muslim. That one could behold the wonders of architectural miracles as a Muslim. And it is this capacity that enabled this civilization to inspire its young to want to continue in that tradition of producing and contributing to this civilization. We need the full range of human capacities to be brought to bear on the challenges and the opportunities that confront us as Muslims in this country. But when we are reduced to the point that we grow suspicious of human capacity. We grow suspicious, if not even resentful, of human intellectual adventurism, as it were. Then what we do is we shut down the very process from the beginning. And I do not wish to be misunderstood here. There are many reasons why Muslims may be suspicious of human capacity in the modern world. The manner in which the modern West in the 19th and the 20th century used these human capacities to visit misery and dislocation upon Muslim communities, it is understandable that those communities might grow suspicious of those very forces. But as Muslims in the world, and as people who are connected with the ultimate source of all power and capability, we must resist this tendency to surrender to those feelings. And we, of all peoples, must resist the temptation to make the very same mistake that none other than Iblis himself made. We must remember that it was Iblis who essentially imagined that it would be better to shut human beings down, to abort this whole business of Allah establishing a Khalifa in the earth. It would be better to abort that whole enterprise rather than run the risk of the kind of corruption and bloodshed that that human being may unleash on the earth. And it was Allah himself who established the fact that yes, corruption may occur. Yes, bloodshed may occur. There may be mismanagement and misfiring of all of our human capacities. But it is precisely in the very fact that we are capable of mismanaging these faculties that God has given us that gives our commitment to properly managing them such profound meaning. And this is what Iblis did not understand. We will make mistakes. We will misfire. But we cannot allow that fact alone to disabuse us of the passion and the commitment to press on and to bring all of our God-given talents to bear on the challenges and the opportunities that confront us. This is one of the biggest challenges that we as modern Muslims confront. Because without all of the God-given talents that God has placed in this community, we will not be able to rise to the challenges that confront us. The entire world is unleashing its talents. We cannot be the ones who refuse to bring the best that we have to bear on life as we know it. We have to understand this. And we have to understand that human capacity, intellectually, artistically, imaginatively, like sex, they're liabilities. But it must be managed, not crushed. Human beings need guidance. They do not need to be obliterated as human beings. We have no alternative other than to be human beings with all of the talents that God has given us, with all of the liabilities that go along with those talents. The only question is whether we will be human beings who are guided and for whom those talents and those inborn capacities are refined by the light of revelation and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, or we are human beings who are not. This is not the time for shrinking. This is the time for standing up and moving forward. And this is the context in which I want to speak to the students of Zaytuna with regard to what I think is one of the challenges that they must aspire to coming to terms with. We are the recipients of a grand and glorious tradition. And I say that not just as a Muslim. I say that as an objective observer, objective reader of Muslim history. When I was in college, I had a professor, very famous professor, named George Muqtasi. George Muqtasi was actually a devout Catholic. But I remember him lecturing in class to a predominantly group of non-Muslims. And one of the points that he made was that Islam had to have been one of the first, if not only, civilizations to reconcile religiosity with intellectual freedom. He said the West was not able to achieve this until after it succeeded in marginalizing religion. Once you marginalize religion and you secularize society, then you can afford intellectual freedom, a place. But he said Islam was able to do this in the context of a religious civilization. We are the recipients of a grand and glorious civilization and a grand and glorious tradition. And yet, one of the challenges that we have to confront as custodians of that tradition is whether or not that tradition is going to serve as a means through which we seek to empower our communities to negotiate a dignified existence as Muslims in this time, in this age, and in this place? Or is the preservation of tradition frozen at some arbitrarily chosen point in the past? Is this preservation going to be the goal that Muslims, and particularly Muslims in educational institutions, carve out and take for themselves? Is our tradition going to be a means of empowerment, or is it going to be a goal to be preserved in some pre-modern, arbitrarily frozen form? This is the challenge that we must confront as those who are involved in Muslim higher education. And in this context, I would like to submit the following, and I understand that my time is limited, so I'll be very brief here. Our charge is to go back and to grab on to our tradition, and then to stretch that tradition into the modern world and into American life, to stretch it forward, to allow it to spread its wings, to derive inspiration from it, to derive instruction from it. But along the way, to reshape it, to modify it, to the point that we render our tradition capable of speaking effectively and prophetically to the realities that define our lives as Muslims, and particularly Muslim Americans. This is our challenge. And as students who are studying in Zaytuna, you must understand that you are the front lines in this challenge. You must go back and get your tradition. And you must get it to the point that you are confident that you have gained access to your tradition, And once you have done that, you must stretch it forth. And you must understand that when you do that, you are operating in the best tradition of your own tradition. Because that is what they did. Each generation understood that its realities may be different from the realities of the generation before it. And that it would have to process those realities on the basis of a tradition that is understood in the context of those realities. This is the charge of you as Zaytuna students. And if you succeed in that charge, you will confer upon your community the gift of empowerment. And if you fail in that regard, then what you will effectively do is that you will present your tradition in such a way that rather than empower your people, it will alienate them. Because it will prove itself incapable of addressing the issues that actually define their lives. This is your charge. And this is one of the reasons why Zaytuna as an institution is such an important institution. Now this charge will be difficult. And I have three little things that I would like to mention before I close. This charge of stretching that tradition forth and getting it to speak effectively to the realities that define our societies. And in so doing, speaking so effectively that rather than shut our people down, we unleash their God-given talents. This is a part of the charge that we have. We are a small community. We do not have the luxury of wasting talent. We need all the talent that we can get. And our tradition must be understood in such a way that unleashes that talent. And we are not afraid. We have the book of Allah. We have the sunnah of his prophet. We have the grand and glorious tradition of Islam. This will be difficult. And it will require an enormous investment in human capital. And you must see yourselves as servants to your communities. It will also require a large degree of intellectual courage. The future does not belong to the intellectually faint-hearted. This will take intellectual courage. And when I say intellectual courage, I don't mean a propensity to say things just because they're controversial. To go against the grain just because it makes me look like I'm somebody. But I mean intellectual courage to face one another with the truth. To face each other with the truth. And to understand that in facing each other with the truth, that doesn't always result in my defeating you or your defeating me. It may result in a more enriched you and a more enriched me. That is what I'm talking about in terms of intellectual courage. We cannot hide behind tradition because modern reality will come and get us no matter where we run to. And we must have the intellectual courage to face it, just like our ancestors did. I wish I had about 5 more minutes. I would share something with you, but I don't have that time because I'll take 1 minute. Just 1 minute, because we don't have an appreciation of what our ancestors achieved. When Muslims come out of Arabia and they go into places like Iraq and Transoxiana, Greater Iran, we don't realize that Muslims were a numerical minority for 300 years. All this nonsense about Islam spreading by the sword, nonsense. they remained a numerical minority for 300 years. That meant that in their capacity as a numerical minority, they had to confront constructs of thinking, worldviews, philosophical and religious traditions that contravened Islam. And they could not run from them. They could not simply hurl insults at them. They had to confront and engage them. And that is what they did. And here we are in modern America facing intellectual constructs, world views, propensities for looking at the world. And we must too have the intellectual courage and confidence to confront them. We must have intellectual courage. This intellectual courage, however, in order for it not to misfire, I have just one more point and I'll stop. It is profoundly important that we establish pristine clarity and an unwavering commitment to our essentials as Muslims. And it's precisely important that we establish this pristine clarity and unwavering commitment to these essentials so that the area of non-essentials can be the object of our full capacities as Muslims. Where we can debate, where we can agree or disagree, where we can even experiment, because we know that these are not issues that will touch the core of Islam. But if we don't have pristine clarity on what our essentials are, what we end up with, everything becomes an essential. And therefore we're allowed to differ on nothing. We're allowed to debate nothing. We're allowed to experiment on nothing. This is a part of the challenge that we have to confront. Also, we have to, again, reinvest in one of the most astounding features of our own tradition. And that is that we do not expect every argument, every debate, every controversy to yield a single univocal answer. Not every debate is susceptible to a single univocal answer. There are answers that I favor, but I understand that there are equally plausible alternatives to that answer. And this is a part of our tradition that we, especially as moderns, must reinvest in. And finally, we must realize that Zaytuna as an institution is not only a lifelong project, its success is something that cannot be achieved in any one lifetime. None of us will likely live long enough to see Zaytuna come to its full and complete success. And here I'm reminded of the words of a great American Christian theologian. وَالْحِكْمَةُ ضَالَةُ الْمُؤْمِنِ. We have no problem with this. Reinhold Niebuhr said that anything that is worth committing one's life to is not likely to be achieved in a single lifetime. And therefore, we must be buoyed by hope. And we cannot allow the enormity of the challenge to reduce us to hopelessness. Remember that, because there will be dark days. Remember that, because there will be challenges that seem to be insurmountable. قُلْ فَاعْمِلُوا سَيَرَى اللَّهُ عَمَلَكُمْ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَسَتُرَدُّونَ إِلَى عَالِمِ الْغَيْبِ وَالشَّهَادَةِ فَيُنَبِّئُكُم بِمَا كُنتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. That our job is to work as hard as we can and to place our hope and our trust in God Almighty. And to know that whether He brings our efforts to success in this life or not, that all of our efforts will be rewarded in full in the life to come when we come to meet him. Jazakumullah khair, and I apologize for going over my time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.